So I want to say again, thank you to Senator Tester for his remarks this morning. I think extraordinarily well set out some of the complexity in the charge that we have before us. And to start down the path of some further conversation about that, to try and deepen our discussion of it, I want to go ahead and invite our first panel of speakers up this morning, give them a chance to get settled in, and then we will dive right back in.
He's got one, so we're good.
Okay, I think we are ready to dive back in. It is my pleasure to introduce our first panel of this morning, which will be thinking or discussing and introducing sort of broadly framed how we got to where we are now. So thinking a little bit about the historical energy, economic, and social issues associated with coal and its development here in Montana and throughout the West. So it is my pleasure to introduce, starting from my right, Dr. Robert Godbey from the University of Wyoming, Dr. Robert Lifseth from the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Sean Boone? Hasboon. I've been practicing that all morning. Didn't work very well.
It's okay.
From Evergreen State College, and Dr. James Allison from Christopher Newport University. So take it away.
Great. So thanks, Eric. So I'm Robert Godbey, as Eric said. A little bit of background, and I'll introduce our panel a little bit so you know where we're all from and what we do. I am the economist on the panel, so while the senator mentioned that issues are much wider than just employment and output, as an economist, that's pretty much what I look at. So I will mention those things. And then we hope with this panel to kind of widen it out to the broader context and actually begin the conversation today about that. So with respect to this morning's panel, I guess we have about 75 minutes. The Wheeler Center has kind of prided itself in creating a conversation. And so we've tried to restrict our comments initially to just some background stuff, and then we have a few questions that we've kind of prepared among ourselves to kind of flesh out some issues that we think are important, or maybe we'll start along the trip to trying to come to grips with the questions that we're looking at. It'd be great if we could find some solutions, but at the start, it's just beginning to think about these things. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, things that people want to talk about or have questions about. So to my immediate right is Robert Lifseth. And just to give you a little bit of background, he's an associate professor of history in the Honors College at the University of Oklahoma. He teaches a wide range of energy courses, and he's also an author. He's written The Power on the Hudson, Storm King Mountain, and the Emergence of Modern American Environmentalism. He's been an editor. He recently was the editor of American Energy Policy in the 1970s, and his work has appeared in journal articles and other outlets. Next to him is Sean Olson Hasboon, which I almost got right. She's an assistant professor of sociology and environmental studies at Evergreen College in Washington. She has a PhD in natural resource sociology from Utah State. where she looks at community impacts of energy development. And she's really spent her career doing that in the Intermountain West region in particular, looking at traditional energy extraction, large-scale renewable development impacts as well. And her main interest is kind of the social dimensions of the energy transition and challenges that occur, especially in the rural West. And then next to her, our final panelist is Jamie Allison, who's an assistant professor of history at Christopher Newport University, but he's also had another career as an energy and environmental attorney. So again, we kind of have a wide perspective here of history, sociology, history again, but also background in legal aspects. And Jamie's scholarship focuses on the impacts of energy development on rural communities and landscapes, and how those experiences push back the national policies. So, basically the back and forth of policymaking. And his research has focused in part on Native communities. He's written a recent book, Sovereignty for Survival, American Energy Development and Indian Self-Determination, where he kind of looked at these forces among American Indian groups in the 70s. And he's currently studying Appalachia and the impacts there. So that's our panel. It is not just, the very shallow economic aspects, but really the deeper social and historical context that coal represents in communities across the country. So we'll start with that. But first, we'll each just kind of open up to some things that we're thinking about, some background to kind of give us kind of a common place to start, and then we'll open up to questions. So I was as the panel moderator, I get to go first. And talking to Eric and the organizers, the first thing we asked was, what are the questions that you want to answer today? So, in order, how's the future of coal and its past more complicated than kind of that jobs environment conflict that you often hear about? The second and third, what sorts of challenges does that complexity kind of pose? Are they well understood? Should they be discussed? And the third is, moving forward, what kinds of opportunities do these changes create to, in part, deal with social, environmental, economic challenges, other impacts, but also opportunities for the future? Where do we go from here? So to give a little bit of background, and this will not be any surprise to anybody who's in a place like Montana, this is just, we do start with the initial employment impacts. So these are just two graphs. When the line goes down, that's bad. When the line goes up, that's good. You can see that the one on the left is the national situation, and coal employment in the country has been declining very quickly over the recent decades. It's declined since the 1980s by about 70%. Since 2012, nationally by about 40%. You can see that that's kind of moderated right at the end of that trend. The picture on the right is actually Montana's, which is actually a little brighter in the sense that there's been an expansion in Montana through the 2000s, and that was reflected right through until recently. But what we see then is that there's been about a 15% decline in the last couple of years, and that reflects current economic conditions. If we're thinking about production, which is the output of all of these workers, nationally, in about the last 5 years, it's down about 25%. And again, Montana's been a slightly brighter spot. It's declined, but only by about 20%. So these changes going on are partly driven by markets with respect to production, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But the challenges to employment, even if you were to overcome the market problems, are ones that are ongoing in most industries, which is things like automation and changes in the workplace that mean that even if you were to bring production back, the way we mine coal, for example, has changed a lot, and you wouldn't be bringing back all of those workers back into the mines at the same time because some of those jobs no longer exist. So that's the employment background that kind of brings us here. If we go a little further, and hopefully. There we go. So if we kind of look at the causes of the decline in coal recently, they kind of come down to a few things. And if our clicker will work. So the first one really is deregulation. Deregulation started in the 1980s. This has really kind of opened the markets to new or alternative sources of energy. It's also made the environment much more competitive. So there you go. and that really began in the 1980s and 90s. And that, prior to that, you could think of the old energy model as, the city, the local load center, they had their generator, and that was it. More recently, though, markets have opened to competition, and it was this deregulation that also opened up new forms of energy. So, for example, the renewable industry really opened up under deregulation because suddenly companies had to buy power from the cheapest source. They weren't responsible for producing it. That's kind of laid the groundwork. The second obviously is much more recent. The biggest problem that coal has faced in the last decade, people often talk about a war on coal. I mean, I often argue to people that if there was a war on coal, it was kind of declared around 2008 when the fracking boom really began. I mean, this has really been the biggest driver of the downturn in the coal markets that we've actually seen. Basically, the problem is natural gas is less than half the price that it used to be. And if you're producing electricity, to build a power plant, a natural gas power plant is much cheaper to build, much cheaper to operate, has fewer emissions. And so this has really changed the energy market. And if we look at the amount of electricity produced by natural gas versus coal, for example, they've kind of switched places, where coal used to be about 50% of our electricity generation. Now it's struggling to stay at 30%, while natural gas has gone above 30%. So this is, and we don't expect really that to change as long as we have abundant natural gas the way we do. The third thing that's really driving this, though, that comes out of deregulation is consumer preferences. There used to be a time where people didn't really get to choose where their electricity came from. And nowadays, we see that kind of reflected in two ways. Locally, one of the problems that, Montana faces, say, for example, people around Colstrip, is the fact that consumer preferences in the Northwest are to not use coal. And so, regardless of where your position is on that, that's where they are. And so, if it's more expensive, oftentimes people are still willing to pay more for it. So we see this deregulated market has allowed consumers to vote with their feet. The second is we see preferences also in politics. 29% of states, or sorry, not 29%, 29 states have renewable portfolio standards where they are required to produce a certain amount of electricity as part of their total use from renewables. And again, that's a consumer preference reflected in political outcomes, which have been remarkably stable over changes of party. The final two, the final one that we hear about, there are now new sources of generation that are very cost effective. Many people are unaware of this, but wind energy is actually the cheapest form of energy to build out. If a company is looking to build new generation, in many places, by far the cheapest form of new generation, despite the fact that it's intermittent, despite the fact that it's also uncertain when the wind will blow, is wind. And solar is coming up very quickly. Those cost declines are now in the marketplace, and so it's again something that coal and natural gas, nuclear, the traditional sources, are feeling pressure from. And then finally, one that gets a lot of press, but I've listed it last, is regulation. So a big part of the downturn that's occurred in coal recently is market-driven, almost all of it, but certainly regulation plays a part. It affects the costs of coal-fired power plants. And in Montana, for example, regulation has played a big part in changes in Colstrip, right? Units 1 and 2 are closing in part due to a court settlement. So again, while regulation nationally has been a minor role in the downturn recently in coal, locally it can play a very big role. The second thing is future regulations are uncertain, and that poses a problem as well, in particular greenhouse gas regulation. And so these are all kind of the drivers of part of the transitions that we're seeing today. So just what does that mean? And again, if we can click, thank you. So just some of the implications here. These are just some projections that go out to 2050, so it's kind of crystal ball gazing that are done by the Energy Information Agency. All we can say for certain about these projections is that they will be wrong. But what these models are actually used for is to kind of, given our current state of knowledge, not to project out to 2050, because we know political events, other things will change. What we do is we do our best as economists anyway, and other people who run these models, is not to use them as projections where things are going, but to see how sensitive they are to changes in economic conditions. If you look at those two lines around it, the biggest driver, as I said, is natural gas. The light brown line is what happens to coal production if natural gas prices go back up. If they go even lower, the green line. So you can see, though, that the decline in coal, our best guess in almost all scenarios is it's permanent. This is the kind of new normal. So this is coal-fired generating capacity. So it just basically stays in these projections kind of constant, at least in terms of output, through to 2050, although plants continue to close and no new ones are being built, mainly because of economic decisions of the utilities. So what does that mean then for coal production? Coal production follows exactly the same pattern. And so if we were to see where the coal has been and where the projection is, that projection is sensitive to assumptions, but none of the scenarios that people project see coal coming back to where it was unless you get extraordinary economic conditions. And so that's kind of the driver of demand and production. But on the other side, if we think about some benefits here, where climate change is a very big concern today, emissions from the power sector are also permanently lower. One thing about coal, unless new technologies are developed, it'll be really challenged in a carbon-constrained world because coal produces about twice the carbon emissions that natural gas does. And of course, new technologies don't produce any, at least in the production of electricity. And so those are kind of the challenges that we're working at now. So what I'll do is I'll pass this over. That's kind of the background as an economist sees it. I'll pass this to Robert next to me and have some thoughts more about the historical perspective.
There we go. All right. All right, so thanks, Rob. That's giving us a sense of where things are right now. As a historian, I want to take the lens back a little bit further and try to look at the bigger picture. If there's one argument I want to make today, and this is going to be very, very short, I'm going to have an opportunity to speak while you're all having lunch, and so I want to give my other panelists as much time as possible. If there's one argument I want to leave you today, it's that coal has been in decline for 100 years. And so, can we hear? Coal has been in decline for 100 years. And so, what you're experiencing today is perhaps unique to the West, but not unique from a national perspective. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so this is a graph of coal production and consumption from 1850 to about last year. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, does this thing work? Does he not see this, right? And I can see, I'm not blind, but for the moment I want you to forget about this over here. Just forget about that and focus on this over here, all right? Because this is the beginning, this is important. So the rise of coal in the 19th century allowed us to slip the Malthusian environmental limits on population, economic growth. It produced enormous social, cultural, environmental, and political changes. and I'm not going to do a whole history of coal in 5 minutes, but we're going to run through a couple of things really quickly. This is really important because in American energy history, it's very unusual for any source of energy to decline in production and consumption. When we see energy transitions, typically the new form of energy that's becoming more important or dominant is simply picking up more of the slack from an economy that is quickly growing. And so it's once we go to the next slide, you can kind of get a sense of this. This is the history of energy consumption from 1775 to 2009. There are a couple of, oil goes up and down a little bit here, but coal is really the only, in this period of time, the only source of energy that goes sideways. So for example, in the 18th century, wood was one of the dominant forms of energy. Last year, we used more wood than we did in any given year in the 18th century. Right? So, in American energy history, we're always using more of everything. And this is kind of an exception. So why? Coal was originally envisioned by its early boosters as a form of energy that would liberate humanity from drudgery. It would lift us into a new world defined by well-being and leisure time. It would alter the material reality of our world, and it accomplished all those things. And this is another theme in American energy history. Every new source of energy that comes down the pike gets projected onto it our hopes and yearnings. And there's a sense that this is going to bring a kind of, well, I shouldn't say brave new world, but a great new world. And that's perhaps a little bit unfair because no form of energy ever truly lives up to the hype, and in coal in particular, that's true. It produced a series of social problems, political problems, many of which had to be addressed in the early 20th century in the progressive era, some of which are still lingering with us. Child labor in factories that could now run all times of day and night, company towns, political corruption, labor militancy, a dirty environment, enormous economic inequality which produced political instability. Few today would think of coal as a vehicle upon which to create this kind of new utopia. And so, for these reasons and others, you see coal being displaced by oil here, coal being displaced by natural gas here, and it's not just because other forms of energy are cheaper. In fact, in this period of time, in the electricity utility business, coal is cheaper than oil and nuclear power, and yet oil and nuclear power are displacing coal in the 1950s and 1960s. So in the first half of the 20th century, because coal is harder to transport, process, use, and mine than any other fossil fuel, it couldn't be burned in internal combustion engines, it's inefficient for space heating, it's too dirty for many industrial processes. The industry itself was often described as sick. This is a lot of good news, right? It enjoyed a reputation for disorder and turmoil, characterized by strikes, violence, and unstable prices. And then, of course, it produced an enormous number of environmental consequences, which aren't suddenly discovered in the 1960s and 70s. Go back to the very first slide for a second. The first slide for a second. It kind of demonstrates this is a Claude Monet painting from 1904. The next one, the first one. There you go. Right? The environmental consequences of coal are thought about. They're understood. People are beginning to become increasingly cognizant of them at the late 19th, early 20th century. Some of these environmental problems include acid drainage, subsidence, black lung disease, scarred and unproductive land from surface mining, air pollution in the form of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, carbon dioxide, water pollution in the form of thermal and chemical discharges, coal ash and sludge. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. So go to the next slide. So for these reasons, coal's share of total U.S. energy market suffered a steep decline from 90% in 1900 to 17% in 1974. So in 1900, right around here, coal is responsible for 90% of the U.S. energy diet. By 1974, it's responsible, up here, it's responsible for 17%. And despite this renaissance, it still holds steady at about 17%, right? Because all these other forms of energy are increasing at that time. By the 1970s, coal was used for a little more than metal smelting and electricity generation, mostly for electricity generation. The Western industry, go to the last slide. Go to the next one. The Western industry is largely born in this renaissance that starts in the 70s. right? So this is coal production by location, with this slide west of the Mississippi, blue east of the Mississippi. So, I mean, if I were to say coal's been in decline for a century, this would not be a novel argument in Appalachia or in the East Coast. Perhaps this is an East Coast perspective. And yes, there's coal production in the West prior to the 70s, but it's relatively inconsequential. The Western coal industry, the coal industry especially centered here in Montana and Wyoming, really grows up in this renaissance in the 1970s for a couple of reasons. One of which is actually environmental. Western coal has a lower sulfur content than Appalachian coal. And as new air pollution laws come into effect, this gives Western coal a competitive advantage. But also, Western coal tends to be non-unionized. It tends to use surface mining, which is replacing people with capital. It's more efficient and cheaper in that sense. All right, so go back one slide. One more. Okay, so if coal is in decline, obviously here, then what is this, right? Why is this declining? I think Rob kind of spoke to why this is declining. What happened in the 1970s and why did it happen? That's going to be what I'm going to talk about during lunch, right? So I'm going to give you a little teaser. I'm not going to answer that question now. You're going to have to stick around and have lunch, and I'll talk about what happened in the 1970s. I will say that I think what happened, I think this is explained by conditions in the 70s that are not reproducible, or that are very highly unlikely to be repeated. So I don't think this is a pattern, right? So if and as a historian, you have to take I'm cautious about predicting the future. I really don't like predicting the future because everybody is wrong in predicting the future. It's part of the human condition. We don't really know what the future is going to hold. We can only guess. I would guess if we were to extend this timeline out a generation, another 30 or 40 years, this is going to look like an aberration. That this is not going to repeat itself, and that coal is going to decline, snap back to some level that is more consistent with this, then return to a future which looks like this. All right. Thanks.
You guys are buzzkills.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a little bit sick, so if I awkwardly refuse to shake your hand later, I'm protecting you. So as a sociologist on the panel, I'm going to comment a little bit on some social dimensions to the history and the present situation of coal-based energy production in the West. So I first want to talk about the consequences and conditions of what we call resource dependency. The field of rural sociology has long studied this condition in rural extractive communities of the West, especially the ways that it has created a variety of social and economic vulnerabilities. By resource dependency, we are referring to a condition whereby a community or region is extremely dependent on the extraction or processing of one natural resource, such as coal, as the primary source of economic activity. So this slide I have up here just demonstrates mining-dependent communities, counties across the nation as determined by the Economic Research Service of the USDA. And they have maps like this showing dependent counties for all sorts of indicators like farming dependent counties and government employment dependent counties, things like that. So here's the mining one. While the energy industry can obviously be economically significant for local communities, contributing to tax revenue and employment and raising wages, it also carries with it a variety of liabilities deriving from a boom-bust and stagnation cycle. In general, social scientists, sociologists tend to view the condition of resource dependency as a source of some pretty serious problems for communities, especially rural communities. And this is in large part because dependency involves a cycle of instability driven by volatile patterns of economic and technological change and limited local economic diversification. There are both economic and social problems that have been linked to this cycle of instability. And despite the initial appearance of good jobs in resource-based industries, some of the long-term economic effects can be generally negative, including higher levels of unemployment, underemployment, and higher than average poverty that persists over the long term. These problems are linked to the limited ability of resource-dependent communities to respond and adapt to changes. Sociologist Will Freudenberg called this over-adaptation of a community to one industry, which of course limits flexibility and adaptability. There are also a variety of social problems linked to the condition of resource dependency. We found that residents of these places have an overwhelming sense of powerlessness to do anything about their situation, and can have some depression and resignation to kind of this fate of an unstable life. Go ahead. So about a year and a half ago, so I conduct research in energy-dependent communities, and I've done most of my research in Utah and Wyoming, so not Montana, but I think there are lessons we can draw across these places. So about a year and a half ago, I was conducting research interviews in 2 mining-dependent counties in Utah. And this sense of hopelessness was incredibly apparent in Emery County, which used to have over 10, 15 coal mines, all of which have been shut down but one. And one man I talked with in that area told me that he had been witnessing his miner friends losing their jobs, becoming depressed, and starting abusing substances even. So I'm just gonna read this quote from him. He said, "You watch a friend or two spend time at the bar, you can tell that it starts depressing them, especially that young coal miner who started his career thinking now he's got it made to raise his family, and all of a sudden his bubble's bursting. Even though they have opportunities to go somewhere else, they don't. Some of those people say, my family's here, I'm gonna stay here, but they don't find work and they start pulling lots of unemployment or picking up a few jobs. They hit that depression stage, and then it's like psychologically they're beat up. They lost the hope and they lash out in other ways." So everyone I spoke with, miner or not, referred to the depressive state that had settled throughout the county and the significant social, economic, and cultural impacts they felt they had suffered. The outmigration of their children, their neighbors, the inability of anyone to sell a house and leave even if they really wanted to, and the long absences of working individuals who had found jobs in energy fields afar. Resource-dependent communities face significant outmigration of human capital during downturns and periods of economic stagnation. On the flip side, they can experience a large influx of newcomers during energy booms, which has been linked to general social disruption and things like increased deviance and crime, and other social problems, what psychologist Dean Kors termed the Gillette syndrome decades ago, after the town of Gillette, Wyoming experienced rapid population growth in conjunction with the boom in coal mining. In addition to depression during downtimes, sociologists have observed how the intermittent reinforcement of boom periods can cause unrealistic expectations that things will soon turn around, and the consequence of that is that it can delay action to work to develop some changes when there's a downturn. Communities facing economic decline and desperation when a turnaround fails to happen can tend to pursue bad deals involving a variety of undesirable development activities. Additionally, in the face of limited alternatives, communities might also pursue a dependency substitution in which they turn all the focus onto another primary industry which does not reduce any of their vulnerabilities. I want to also briefly talk about the role and importance of culture and identity in resource communities. Culture can be a really positive force, fostering social cohesion and order through shared understandings of norms and values and a shared way of life. Culture can also, at times, be a blinding force, limiting the ability of communities to acknowledge changing conditions or act to adapt. Communities that have been dependent on a primary industry for a long time have a really strongly cohesive and deep-rooted local culture built on the history and ways of life associated with coal extraction as well as conversion to electricity. The energy transition and the decline of coal pose not only economic problems for communities and individuals, but also pose an acute sense of loss of culture, identity, and history. It was really apparent from my conversations with individuals in Emery County, Utah, that they were suffering from that sense of loss, that their history and their culture and their identity were not only going away, but that they were under attack. One person told me, "It feels like coal is just getting singled out and picked on. It seems like all of a sudden this last 5 years, it feels like if someone stubs their toe, it's the fault of coal." So where do these observations leave us in terms of moving forward and mitigating some of the impacts of the energy transition for resource-dependent communities, as well as addressing some of the impacts more broadly of energy production in the West? Well, to start with, it's really important to acknowledge that there's a lot of variation from place to place and community to community. For example, in Gillette, Wyoming, local people are rallying around the hashtag Stay Strong Gillette. And there's a lot of optimism there around the future of coal, including the return of some mining jobs, and also regarding some new businesses and industries that have come in to provide other sources of jobs. However, the story is different in other communities. I mentioned Emery County in Utah. And the residents I spoke with there in the depressed coal communities told me they thought this downturn was different. In this way, they didn't really conform to the mentality of hope that we sociologists have found kind of pervades resource-dependent communities during bust periods. While of course, they didn't like it, most of them felt that, at least for their community, it was the beginning of the end of coal. And with that came a very heavy and multifaceted sense of loss. They acknowledged that, in a sense, this feeling of this being the end could drive local change because they could no longer just hope for the next energy boom. So while they were really suffering from that feeling, they felt that there was at least some hope for it to drive change. Go ahead. There's quite a lot of variety as well in each community's level of vulnerability that has to do with its unique social and geographic context. The set of figures, which is probably very hard to read, I'm sorry, it appeared in a recent paper analyzing the impact of planning around coal plant retirement in the West. And I think we have one of the paper's authors in the audience today, and we'll be hearing from him later, so hopefully I'm not stealing his thunder. The authors make the point that the social impact of coal retirement in isolated counties will likely be much greater and harsher than in some other counties because of existing multiple vulnerabilities. So in each of these indicators, the bar on the left shows the isolated counties as opposed to the connected and metro counties. So the isolated counties have lower levels of earnings per job, higher income volatility, lower levels of education, and so forth. So those existing vulnerabilities kind of compound with a coal plant closure, for example. So in Montana, Colstrip is an example of what they call a double isolated community, in that the county itself is an isolated county, but the location of the coal plant is also in an isolated part of the county. By contrast, where I live in southwestern Washington, the Centralia coal-fired power plant is scheduled for retirement in the next few years, but that county is a lot bigger, less isolated, and has other industries there. So to conclude, declining and transitioning energy communities will need to take care not to fall into some of the patterns I mentioned previously, namely substituting one dependency for another or agreeing to bad deals. Coal and other fossil fuels-based communities will need to focus on boosting their capacity to adapt to changing economic conditions while simultaneously addressing the psychological and social issues that arise in the face of community economic decline, as well as cultural loss. It will be very important to continue to celebrate the shared history and culture of resource extraction in these places, while at the same time moving forward and building new industries, cultural traditions, and identities. So as scholars, practitioners, and policymakers addressing the energy transition, we need to keep in mind not only the economic hardships facing these places, but also the cultural and social loss that they're experiencing. And we also need to remember that there are very different levels of vulnerabilities, and the impacts of something like a coal plant retiring will be felt very differently in different places. And I think that would be my main argument to leave you with. And additionally, I think we owe it to these places to help during this difficult time of transition, as they've been providing our energy for decades and decades. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
It's a rosy panel to start the day, right? I'm not sure mine will be that much better, though I do have some success stories in here. It's good to be here. I'm a historian, and so what we do is we tell stories about the past to hopefully illuminate lessons that may be applicable to the present. And so the lesson I want you to convey out of the story I'm going to tell is that conditions across many scales matter when trying to understand how and why energy development occurs or doesn't, right? So local concerns at the place of extraction, those community concerns matter quite a bit. National policies that incentivize certain development and maybe not others, that matters. And of course, global economic forces matter quite a bit in trying to understand whether energy development occurs. A lot has to happen. And so if we look at this particular story that I'm going to talk about today, that is energy development on the Crow and Northern Cheyenne reservations in the context of the energy crisis of the 1970s, what we'll see is that there was a confluence across scales of conditions that first brought development to these reservations. But then these local conditions shifted to trigger this indigenous response to reclaim tribal control of those resources. But just as that indigenous response was successful, global conditions, economic conditions shifted again to close the door on otherwise promising Indian-led energy projects. Again, a lot has to align. So first, the confluence. We need like a signal. To cut right to the chase, circa 1973, here's a look at the Northern Cheyenne and Crow reservations. By this time, energy prospectors, energy companies had opened up or had gained the right to prospect on over 600,000 acres across the two reservations. That's more than half the total landmass of the Northern Cheyenne. And if you can note here, the names involved, these are the biggest players in the energy industry: Gulf, Shell, Peabody Coal, Chevron. They're all here, right? And here's the thing to keep in mind. The Crow and the Northern Cheyenne were ecstatic to have them. At least initially, right? At least the tribal governments were. Ever since the first coal proposal started coming in the mid-1960s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and tribal officials labored hard to secure a lucrative payday. Now, I could go into greater details about those efforts, but the larger point I want to make here is that these local desires to alleviate poverty through energy development operated within a national regulatory system that really rendered tribal officials ignorant to the true value of their coal, or at best with an incomplete understanding of the social and environmental impacts of this scale of development, right? So the key provision in this really broken, as I would describe it, national legal system was this 1938 Indian Mineral Leasing Act, which was one of the products of John Collier's Indian New Deal. So that's John Collier there. He was Franklin Roosevelt's Commissioner of Indian Affairs during the time. And he's a really interesting character. On the one hand, he did a lot to alleviate really heinous 19th century policies aimed at assimilating and just exterminating tribal culture. But on the other, Collier himself was a hopeless, paternalistic progressive. By this I mean he wanted tribes to develop reservation economies, but he believed they were incapable or unprepared to do so themselves, or at least to do so in a way that wouldn't compromise their customs and values. And so he thought they needed the federal experts to act as intermediaries between Indian tribes and the broader capitalist economy. So this 1938 Act borrowed heavily from the 1920 Minerals Leasing Act, which governs development on public land, by authorizing tribes only to lease out their mineral interests to outside developers and not develop their own resources. In Collier's estimation, federal experts would kind of take the lead in surveying the reservations, assessing market conditions, and then do deals with energy companies, delivering only the final details of those deals to their tribal wards for final sign-off, right? Or so the theory went. Now, the problem was, of course, the federal trustees were at least as unprepared as Collier believed his Indian wards to be in doing deals with multinational energy companies. In particular, and the conditions that maybe Bob will clue us into later in his talk, if we stick around for it, in the post-war conditions, which included explosive Western energy demand, multinational energy firms looking to diversify their portfolios with cheap Western coal, and the coming of the Clean Air Acts. There were several iterations across the 60s that incentivized the low sulfur Western coal like we have here in the Powder River Basin. In this context, the federal trustees simply failed to live up to their duty. Lacking experience, lacking expertise, they deferred to energy companies who did the legwork of surveying reservations and public land and suggesting to the government which tracts to open up for development and under what conditions. Here's the results of that program, right? In the 1960s in particular, mineral leasing on public and Indian land exploded. Millions of acres of land were open to development, returning meager royalties to public and Indian mineral owners. Indian tribes in the 1960s recovered on average 15.8 cents per ton. To put that in perspective, in 1972, the average price of Western coal in the open market was $7.66. And to be clear, not one of those leases represented in that graph, not one, since the inception of the leasing program in 1920, and as it included Indian reservations in 1938, not one was triggered at the behest of the tribal or the federal government. all were done under the leadership of energy firms, right? So this is the larger context within which those local desires for development were embedded. But the local conditions were changing. In 1971, I don't know how many of you, have you heard of the North Power? Okay, yes, one. Okay, good, all right. A seemingly innocuous kind of drab technical document issued by the Department of Interior and a bunch of other private and public utilities proposed to build 42 power plants across the Northern Plains that would produce more electricity than any nation in the world at that point, except the United States and the Soviet Union. The document also produced opposition, right? So as probably more of you know, in April of 1972, in this fair city, the Northern Plains Resource Council was organized to fight that impending development, which included, of course, the Colstrip power plant. This rather interesting alliance of ranchers and environmentalists then carried that news to the reservations, where by the fall of 1972, a group on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, calling themselves the Landowners Association, were rallying tribal members to oppose deals that their government had secured. By the spring of '73, that movement had captured the tribal government, and the council resolved to cancel all leases on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. The following year, the Crow followed suit, canceling all contracts for coal development on the reservation, but allowing development to occur just north of the reservation on the ceded strip, where the tribe had ceded surface rights long ago, but had retained subsurface mineral rights. Now, importantly, I want to emphasize, if we could, the nature of this resistance from both the Crow and the Northern Cheyenne. It centered not so much on potential environmental impacts, or even environmental impacts framed as physical destruction of sacred landscape. That was not the center of the concerns. The center of the concerns were that hordes of non-Indian coal miners would descend upon these reservations, making them minorities in their own land, and that those people would disrupt the norms and customs that represented and sustained their indigenous community. These groups acted, in other words, to save the tribe. Now, that rationale, I think, is important because it would be wrong to label either tribe, then or now, as anti-development per se. These groups opposed this development that they could not control for the very good reason that they wanted to preserve their community. Sovereignty, in this sense, control over development, assured survival, right? So from this intensely local opposition to preserve community in place, something remarkable then did happen. The Crow and the Northern Cheyenne kind of worked together to spearhead this kind of national pan-tribal movement to prepare other tribes to do the same thing, to be able to control, plan, and develop their own resources. Working with the federal government, these groups eventually formed the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, which used federal funds to hire energy consultants to work with the tribal governments to expand their capacity to pursue their own projects. The rub here, of course, is that the federal law didn't allow them to do that, right? That 1938 act, the Paternalistic Act, authorized tribes only to lease out minerals to outside developers, not pursue projects themselves. But now that the tribes had developed this requisite capacity, that old law had to go. In the context then of the 1980s, when federal officials were touting an Indian self-determination policy and extolling the virtues of energy independence based on domestic production, the fix was relatively painless. In 1982, energy companies, tribal governments, and federal officials all supported the passage of this Indian Mineral Development Act, which allowed tribes to develop their own resources in whatever manner they saw fit, subject always, of course, to approval from the federal trustee, right? Nevertheless, for many, sovereign authority was finally paired with tribal capacity. That's the good news, but the story's not done, right? And the conclusion of the story really further demonstrates the importance of conditions across scales when understanding energy development. Ronald Reagan may have signed that 1982 Indian Mineral Development Act, but he did so with the same hand that slashed the federal Indian budget, including cutting the Department of Energy's entire tribal energy program that really supported the Council of Energy Resource Tribes. Even more damaging than budget cuts, however, was the impact of Reagan's economic policies on global energy prices. The president's accelerated the deregulation of oil, produced a surge in domestic oil supplies as producers moved reserves into this newly unregulated market. That increase in domestic output was matched by an unexpected rise in global production from both non-OPEC and OPEC producers who were rushing to kind of capture this economic windfall created by higher prices after the 1979 energy crisis. The point here is by 1983, the world was flooded with oil. The energy crisis of the 1970s was actually now the oil glut of the 1980s, and cheap oil simply collapsed the market for Indian energy, just as tribes had secured that authority to develop their own minerals, right? So this is the story I wanted to get out there, and I kind of look forward to playing with the implications of it more during our ensuing discussion.
So thank you, Jamie and Sean and Robert. So our opportunity this morning, just as a panel, oftentimes we don't need to talk about it here in Montana as much because it's kind of almost natural here to understand coal's history and also the current challenges. But it's important to kind of line that out to give a little bit more perspective and also to talk a little bit about why coal mining matters or coal matters in a lot more than just an economic sense. So what I will do is pose a few questions to the panel. Really, we have about 4. And then what I'd like to do is open it up to the audience for questions, and then we'll finish our panel. So the first question is really just a broad one, and I'll pose this to each of our 3 panelists. How and why do energy transitions actually occur? Why do they take place? Does anybody want to take that?
That's a big question. That's a big question, and is this on yet? There we go. All right, that's a big question, and within energy history, the source of a kind of long and continuous debate. I think on the one hand, you have an interpretive camp that focuses on political and economic factors that you would be more familiar with, right? And there's another camp that focuses on cultural factors, right? So and this extends beyond the question of why energy transitions take place to a range of questions we might ask about the past, including why does the United States become the largest energy consumer in the 20th century? You could say of oil, for example, right? You could say low oil prices encourage the construction of large automobiles that are not fuel efficient. We're a big spread out country. You could also, but does that explain why we have large automobiles? I mean, there's another camp of people who would say, well, Americans like large automobiles, and that's a cultural preference. And so there's a range of factors, right? I mean, I'll leave it at that.
Other comments?
Yeah, I can add to that a little bit. So I think Rob already did a good job explaining some of the factors involved in this current transition, but he touched on sort of public support for the energy transition. And I just wanted to mention that, there's been nationally representative surveys that have been conducted over the last 10 years, and we've consistently seen high levels of public support and desire for new energy systems, for renewable energy. And that's bipartisan, and that's really significant, I think. And interestingly, it doesn't necessarily correlate, for example, with people's belief about climate change, which is very polarized in the United States. So at least with regard to the current energy transition, it would appear that public opinion and public support for renewable energy development, both at the policy level, but also just at the sort of like individual level of maybe having rooftop solar. The mayor of the town where I got my doctorate degree in northern Utah, very conservative town, he was a huge supporter of rooftop solar because it made so much sense economically as well, and there's a sense of real independence and self-sufficiency in that part of the country, as I think there is here. So it really appeals to him. So I think I just wanted to kind of represent the social side of it and the high level of public support for the current energy transition with regard to renewable energy.
I'm going to add something that sounds like I'm ducking the question, but there's actually substance to this. You could have said this as a historian, but I don't know that I'm wary to to put forth a theory as to how and why energy transitions happen. We can explain, or we can look and analyze past energy transitions and kind of pick those apart. But we need, if energy transitions have taught us anything, it'd be the danger of projecting what we knew about the past ones onto the future, right? I mean, because I was listening to, this is what energy nerds do. I was listening to a podcast recently from a former head of the Department of Energy under the George W. Bush administration, Spencer Abraham. And he wrote a book in 2010 called Lights Out. And in that book, he said the days of cheap oil and gas are over. This is the head of the Department of Energy less than 10 years ago, right? So he didn't, of course, see this fracking revolution and perhaps an energy revolution or energy transition that we're in the midst of now. So, I mean, the only point I make there is just, even, and Rob admitted that, those projections, as sound as they are always subject to contingency.
I would add, the real historian's answer, I'm not
Second
saying
shot.
you're a real historian, right? But I'm picking up on and sort of pushing forward what you're saying. The instinct for the historian is to say every energy transition is taking place for reasons specific to that time and place, right? So, for example, there was a book recently published called Fossil Capital by Andreas Malm that's caused some waves in energy history. And it examines in very close detail the transition to coal in Great Britain in the first third of the 19th century. So the textile industry, which is the first industry to industrialize, is largely powered by direct hydropower, and it experiences this transition to a reliance on coal. And the standard story had long been this takes place because of all the good hydro sites had been occupied and that coal was cheaper. And in fact, when he looked a lot closer, or when he did this 900-page investigation into why there was this transition to coal, the kind of things I guess only I read, it's that there were plenty of hydro sites, and coal was not cheaper than hydropower. In fact, hydropower in Great Britain was cheaper well into the late 19th century. The reason why textile manufacturers transitioned to coal was because it solved significant labor problems. They could move their shops away from the countryside, which is where they had to be located because that's where the power was, into cities like Liverpool, where they had a large pool of labor that they could make use of. They didn't have to worry about attracting workers. They didn't have to worry about firing workers. And it was a more expensive source of energy, but it allowed them to run their plants more efficiently. It saved them, I suppose, money, made them more efficient in other ways. And so that's an example of that particular case, that particular country, that particular period of time. And so I guess the impulse of the historian is to say that it's a little dangerous to look for large patterns.
Right. So one thing I didn't hear our panel mention specifically, and I avoided it in my presentation, is also technology and the impact of technology. I think maybe, Robert, you're talking a little bit about that in the sense that technology doesn't just open new opportunities, but it is often used in unexpected ways. Technologies are developed to do one thing, and for example, even though it may be more expensive, it creates opportunities in other ways, as Robert just mentioned. So, for example, the enablement of these firms to move from countrysides where they may have less labor, worse access to markets, to larger areas where they can consolidate those things. So we'll probably hear a lot more about technology today. The senator this morning in his opening remarks was talking about some new federal projects, and we may come back to that as we kind of circle around to maybe what the role of government is. But if we move kind of forward, so as we think about these transitions going on, one question that we'll all have to deal with is whether there are unique social or community types of capital in rural communities like in Montana or the Intermountain West. What kinds of social capital do they possess that could decrease their economic vulnerability to these sorts of changes? And how could these be used to kind of move as we are in the 21st century? So, Sean, maybe I'll point that at you first because you really do focus on vulnerability, but also on opportunity and how communities adjust.
Yeah, sure. So there's a theory of community capital, and by Flora and Flora sociologists, and they say that there are 7 types of capital that are really important for a vibrant community that has a high level of ability to adapt. And so their point is that we can't just focus on financial capital. So they talk about things like human capital, education, right? Social capital, cultural capital, natural capital, political capital, and built capital. And I guess the one thing I just really want to point to is, especially in small, relatively isolated rural communities, there tends to be a pretty high level of social capital in terms of the cohesion that exists in a community. And so in those places, if communities commit themselves to working toward a change, they can act as one easier than other places can, maybe. And so that would be maybe the first thing I would think of. The second thing that I've noted in my own research and just talking with people in these places is that there's just such a sense of an ethic and way of life around self-sufficiency, independence, problem solving, taking care of each other. And I think those are really important attributes to a community that's in a time of really difficult change and that will help them. And I think that as I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges in these resource-dependent communities is that there's always kind of the hope for the next boom, and that can sort of delay taking steps to increase, for example, economic diversification, increase different types of job training and education and stuff. So that's a big challenge, but these communities do possess a really high level of capacity to make change because of that social capital. I can add to that, but I'll let you guys talk if you want to.
Any other comments from our panelists?
Well, at the risk of, again, saying something unpopular, and undercutting the question somewhat, people can just leave, right? I mean, everyone in this room who's not Native American is the descendant of an immigrant or a migrant. And in this country, I think there's been studies that have shown that a larger percentage of people are not leaving within, or are living within 50 miles of where they were born. And it used to be in this country that we were less afraid of, if economic opportunity didn't present itself, of just leaving and going where it did present itself. And I mean, that's not a solution people want to hear, and it's probably not very popular, but it's certainly an American tradition.
Right. It is a provocative point that in trying to preserve things, sometimes you're undermining what might be, in some cases, people's best choice. In Wyoming, we're always concerned about very much the same things in Montana. Our own native kind of brain drain, and where do our best and brightest go? They often leave the state. And so, that is something to really be concerned about in the sense of when you're trying to preserve a community. But that has historically been how we've dealt with bus, is to move on. And so it's something that has to be kept in mind. So if we kind of think about, we've got Sean's kind of optimistic viewpoint that, there are these strong social and cultural ties in rural America that create kind of a sense of identity that can be utilized or leveraged to potentially give, I suppose, a greater commitment to maintaining those values, and therefore to try to leverage that for further development. But I guess what I'd also have to, the flip side to that, and again, the panelists have seen these questions before to be a little bit ready for them, but the flip side of that would be, so what do energy developers have to understand about the communities, the extractive communities in particular in Montana, as they consider pursuing, newer projects? What makes them viable? How might they respond to other changes? So for example, sometimes it's suggested that renewable energy could be brought into some of these communities. And so what do they need to understand, and what are maybe some of the drawbacks to that solution?
Do you want me to say it?
Yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I've done quite a bit of research on that question, and I first want to say that there's a lot of uncertainty with regard to how much actual on-the-ground jobs bringing a renewable energy facility into a rural community. How much could we actually replace of gone, coal jobs, for example. But what I found is that in terms of community acceptance of renewable energy and the desire to bring that in, it can really go one of two ways. And so in Emery County, I had a lot of conversations about renewable energy. And aside from the question of how much it would actually contribute to the local economy, there was what I found a significant amount of opposition and skepticism just because renewable energy they saw was like the direct reason why they were hurting so badly. And then additionally, they felt that, essentially renewable energy was connected to one side of the political spectrum, which was not their side. And so they were sort of like us versus them mentality. However, in another county where I spent some time doing interviews about renewable energy, that was equally as rural and remote and based on resources, not energy, but resource-dependent community, they were really stoked about renewable energy. They said, why wouldn't we bring it in? It's just another way that we can generate tax revenue. It's another way we can generate lease payments for landowners. And they thought it really, it fell in line with their identity of being like a really independent and self-sufficient people. So it's really interesting. I think it can go one of two ways. And I think, kind of stepping back, we can see that the less renewable energy is directly tied to like an issue like climate change, or less directly tied to politics, that can make a really big difference in how communities might accept renewable energy or even think about it. And of course that makes a difference because a lot of times it is the local people who go out and seek and try to attract renewable energy developers. Yep.
Or oppose the development.
Yeah, or oppose it. Yeah.
I mean, I would get the general answer would be developers need to understand how those communities themselves define themselves, right? So in my case, it's a pretty easy miss by the coal companies in the 1970s, as they basically thought the thing that those tribal communities desired was revenue. And they weren't wrong about that, but they missed a much deeper concern among the people there about the cost involved in that revenue. And I would like to think that, developers wouldn't make that mistake again. But the broader point is they gotta do the homework. They gotta know who the local community is and how that community defines itself.
So one thing I'd mention, if we talk about renewables, the Wyoming experience, we have a lot of wind energy, certainly like Montana. But they're, unlike many other states, so for example, Oklahoma or Texas, which, if you look at them politically, are similar to many of the western states, tend to be red states, if you want to, draw a line, a partisan line. But interestingly, unlike Oklahoma or Texas, Wyoming has not openly welcomed wind, despite the fact that it creates a huge opportunity. And one of the real concerns that's gone on in Wyoming is that there's two things. One is these companies come in and people feel like it's out of their control. So some of the things that Jamie was talking about with respect to the native peoples in Montana is true for everybody. A big concern with major development is that it hasn't been talked about. There is no plan. And one of the things that has gone on, for example, just to the neighbor south in Wyoming, is the fact that there has been no policy. And we have to recognize that as we look forward and we think about how we might develop new challenges, certainly we'd like to see our economies diversify, we'd like to take advantage of opportunities, but the political reaction to just revenue, right? It's new revenue, and oftentimes, short-sightedly, these companies or others will say, hey, that revenue, how could they turn that down? But in fact, communities do want to have a say in how things happen. And sometimes people get tired of me saying this, but no policy is really bad policy. And so you do really need to think about these wider things, the local politics, the local preferences, cultural issues, and how things might change. So for example, if we look at renewables, landscape is a very important value in the West. And clearly those towers while they're not emitting anything, they do change the landscape that we have here, and they're different from what we have allowed ourselves to accept. For example, a mining culture that's been here almost from the very beginning. Which kind of leads to the next question that I'll just pose to the panel, is really what is the proper role for government in these transitions? So for example, how could the federal government empower affected tribal governments? We've heard a little bit about that, but then more widely, federal, state, and local, what can be their roles, or what should be their roles as we kind of adapt and adopt new technologies?
Well, that's the million-dollar question right there. You know, in the 70s, one of the common complaints that we heard in the political discourse was we don't have a national energy policy, right? Carter in the 76 campaign made a lot of, gained some credibility in attacking Ford for we don't have a national energy policy. And periodically in the 40 years since, you've heard politicians say we don't have a national energy policy. And part of the reason we have never really had a national energy policy is because there's no national consensus on what that policy should look like, right? So should it be governed by environmental concerns? Should it be governed by national security concerns? Or should it be governed by domestic economic concerns, right? And which concern gets sacrificed to benefit the other, right? And so as a result, I think what we've seen over the last 40 years is sort of whipsawing between, and you could, whipsawing between extremes. And so an illustration of this would be, Trump administration pulling the Clean Power program that the Obama administration put forward. The Obama administration unsuccessful at obviously privileging environmental interests to some extent in the formulation of energy policy, unable to get that through Congress, tries to do this administratively, and now the Trump administration is undoing it. All of which just suggests that 40 years later there still isn't consensus as to what the proper balance ought to be.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. There are things, a policy, I guess, that comes out of DC that channels down to more local development projects. And if we talk about policy empowering local governments, and in my case, maybe tribal governments would be the local one. So in 1970, there was this announcement of an Indian self-determination policy. Just bear with me for a second, by Nixon. That it was the tribes were going to determine their own fate, and the federal government was going to hand over these programs to tribes once the tribes established their capacity to run those programs, right? And ever since then, and maybe before then, and I'm stealing this from Monty Mills, who's a law professor at the University of Montana. Ever since then, Monty argues that we've looked at federal policy and Indian policy as a zero-sum game. That if the tribes are going to take over, that means the federal government can get out of the game and wash their hands of it, right? And for many Indian peoples, that spanks too closely to termination, to ending the federal trust relationship. And so while certainly many groups want to take on that responsibility, want their governments to take on that responsibility, there's a fear of what risks that it leaves them with. And so what Monty argues, and so I'm just repeating what I hear everywhere else, is that we need to enable local, in this case tribal governments, by creating programs to increase their capacity to have economists and geologists and so forth on staff. And we'll hear from some tribal representatives later today who will probably tell us about how they're doing this or not doing this well enough. But that doesn't mean a pullback from the federal government, right? At the same time, that can be enabled with the federal government can be enabling that increasing capacity. And we started to do that in the 1970s with the Council of Energy Resource Tribes. And then when the market kind of fell out in the 1980s and, because of kind of the political ideology of the administration across the 80s, there was less of a desire to do that. But enabling the local governments to have the capacity to develop their resources in the manner they see fit. Generally, that's where I think federal policy should go.
I want to echo that as well, because in addition to not having a national energy policy, here in the West, there's a long history of significant distrust in federal government. And so I think, turning to local governments and state governments is going to be potentially a lot more successful in helping communities with this transition. And there are already some municipalities in the West and some county level governments that are trying to get control over their own energy, for example, and they're doing that relatively successfully. So yeah, I kind of, to the question of what's the proper role of government, I would almost say, well, what's the potential success of different levels of government?
Right, so one of the, from my perspective, I did pose the question, but just reflecting on what's been said, there are a couple things here. So if we just kind of look at national policies and reactions to things, whether it's trade or energy, one of the real problems that we've had at potentially the federal level is potentially that we've overlooked transitions. How do we adjust to these new policies, and how are we going to accommodate the changes in local communities that occur? And there's been very little safety net for that. So for example, trade agreements, while they broadly benefit society, affect particular areas, and yet we've had very weak political efforts to kind of deal with those transitions. Energy would be another one. Something that Montana has is actually, we've begun to see with the closure of Colstrip, we actually have, the Puget Sound Energy Authority actually creating funds to actually help that transition. People can argue, is it big enough? But there is a potential principle there, which is and Montana has called for this recently. Why aren't we creating resources for these transitions? And that's something that at the federal level, I suppose, it's been absent, but then at the same time, at the state and local level, we have a lack of resources to get there. So this is something also that, that's going to emerge in the political debate, and has already, because many people's reactions are reactions to the changes that they see happening around them that they don't really have control over. So with that, maybe we can open it up to questions from the audience. What questions do you have that you want to talk about today?
Hang on before you guys get started in that, just to let you know, sorry, I apologize, I forgot to note this earlier. As we're capturing the video, we've got a runner with a handheld mic, so if you've got a question, wait for Zach to get to you with the mic so we can get that audio. Thank you.
I have a question regarding bailouts. For the history of the United States, bigger banks have been bailed out. The auto industry has been bailed out. Why not some type of bailout for the coal industry? Because there is a worldwide demand for America's western United States coal, especially from Asian countries. Coal is the base load for the majority of base load energy.
So the question is, can we bail out these? So as I interpret your question, what you're asking is there a role to consider, again, let's put it in a different frame, because bailouts recently especially have become kind of a negative tone, right? The marching orders out of Washington have been no more bailouts. But I think what you're asking about is why not transition funds? Mm-hmm. And I'll pose that to any views from our panelists.
Well, the short answer is, yeah, of course we could bail out the coal industry. And I don't think we will. I don't think that's a popular idea, right? I mean, that's a political choice that the nation has to make, and I don't believe that there will ever be the political will to make that choice.
To a certain extent, I mean, the Energy Secretary Rick Perry just tried this, right, with a major subsidy for baseload coal power, and FERC rejected it. And I mean, these are Republican-dominated FERC committee rejected that because of the damage it would do to the markets.
Right, the Trump appointees, right? I'll talk about this in the luncheon address.
Okay,
what Perry tried to do.
Okay.
I mean, to its credit, Trump has been trying to hold to his promise of reviving coal. He just hasn't been very successful, and I'm not optimistic that he will be successful. But yeah, I mean, the direct answer to your question is, of course we could. But I mean, this is sort of the larger point. Why did the Trump administration feel it had to use FERC in this administrative effort to effectively bail out coal.
yeah.
It could have gone to Congress and said, hey, let's put together a package that's going to subsidize or put a floor beneath the coal industry. Historically, in the past, we've done similar things for oil, natural gas, nuclear power. Coal is not going to benefit. I just don't see coal benefiting from that kind of effort because it doesn't have the political support.
Right. So if we're clear answer on bailout of coal, you're fighting against the current. But what about instead of considering to maintain the status quo, what about offering additional transition resources if we're going to move to a new economy? First of all, do you see that happening? Secondly, if it's not happening, what kind of efforts might be productive to kind of move especially affected communities towards a future maybe that doesn't include what they previously depended on? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but this is happening in Appalachia. There are substantive federal funds being directed down to these regional consortiums that are tapping into what local communities see as the way to transition themselves, which is the model I think we would advocate as we were talking about federal policy empowering local communities to do what they think needs to be done. But again, I read the news about that.
I feel like you're reading from a script that helped Hillary Clinton lose the election. In the following way. The line, seriously, the line that Democrats have held since the early 90s, starting with Bill Clinton when he pushed the party to the center and opened it up to free trade, right, where it hadn't always been, was, okay, there's going to be dislocations, there's going to be particular communities or particular groups of people who are going to be hurt, but we're going to provide money for retraining, or we're going to help them out. But realistically, on a practical level, someone who's in their 50s, are they going to get retrained and find a new job that's going to pay what they were previously making? And I think Trump made some political inroads into traditional Democratic constituencies by suggesting a more substantive approach, which is a critique that said, let's just change the trade laws and tamp down on immigration, and then this problem will take care of itself. And I don't necessarily agree with that analysis, but I think I can understand why people found it persuasive.
Absolutely. Other questions from our audience?
Is this on at all? Okay. I'm wondering if any research has been done in correlating the, let me read my words here. A correlation of the increase in popularity of alternative energy sources and the war on coal and the widespread media in opposition to coal, that is, the presenting of the popularity and the positives of renewable without giving the negative side also.
So to be fair, before I address the panel to try to answer your question, so is your question, has there been any research on the promotion of renewables, and also, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the entire question. The promotion of renewables, and also, is that correlated to, I guess, positive aspects of renewables without outlining what some of the downsides would be? Is that your question?
The historical scholarship on alternative energy is not particularly thick, right? It hasn't been around that long. American historians tend not to start writing history until at least 30 years have passed. So, I was at a panel I was chairing a panel at a conference last month on the 80s, and it freaked me out a little bit because that's now history. That graduate students writing dissertations are starting to write histories of the 80s.
Radical.
Yeah, and this is the reaction I suppose I got 10 years ago when I started writing about the 70s. So yeah, there aren't a lot of studies on the downsides of alternative energy, but there will be downsides. If I were to predict the future, simply because every energy source comes along, and like I said before, we project are, hopes that this is going to produce all of these incredibly positive changes, and oftentimes it does produce positive changes. Even coal in the 19th century produced a lot of positive changes, but we never see what the downsides are on this side of the energy transition. And so, there will be some downsides to transitioning to a reliance on alternative forms of energy, but I don't think we're going to see them until that transition is far more advanced.
To contest a little bit of what you
Sure,
said,
go ahead.
I believe, my understanding is that Montana ranchers have been using wind energy for a long time to power their wells. But maybe. So there's some scholarship from sociology being done looking at some of the downsides to solar energy in particular with regard to the inequity of when solar plants any kind of solar installation gets decommissioned, who actually takes it apart. There's a lot of heavy metals inherent in solar photovoltaic, at least, and the critique currently is that there's not enough protection for those workers, and that those workers tend to be already disadvantaged groups. So yeah, I would say that I think we're starting to look at that question that you posed, but it is pretty nascent still.
I think I'd add maybe, and part of this comes from your research, Sean, is that it really depends on who you talk to. I mean, people project on things, their beliefs, as Robert just said, in some ways. Renewables have certainly been a flashpoint, but if you look at where renewables started, what have become larger scale renewables, the idea that you could power the grid with renewable energy, that really began after deregulation began in the 1980s. The door that opened to that was, the PURPA rules that required companies, utilities, to use alternative forms of energy beyond the ones that they actually built themselves, if it could be offered competitively. And that opened the door. They weren't, at the time, utilities weren't, they were pretty comfortable where they were. They had their own utility, generation assets. They ran them themselves. They were rate regulated, so there wasn't a lot of competitive pressure. And opening up the markets to competition and then requiring them to use, even utilities that are rate regulated, to use alternative energy if it's available and cost effective, kind of opened the door to people starting to do research in that area. And one thing about renewables that should be pointed out is it's not just a left or right thing. If you look at where renewable energy is expanding, particularly wind, and you were to look at the top states in wind, they're as much red as they are blue. Another thing about how it started, oftentimes people would say, well, it was, people with, call them the hippies, if you want to start with, say, the environmental movement, which was often associated with, kind of this alternative idea, which became mainstream in the 60s and 70s. But at the same time, people that were very interested in renewables were also a very libertarian group that wanted to be independent. And so those kind of two very different, two sides of the political spectrum came together. I would say now, though, that the biggest, renewables get probably the largest part of their push now from the fact that they are just the cheapest form of energy available. If a utility is looking to build new generation, in many cases, they will look at wind because it's the cheapest form of new generation to build. Just a couple states south in Colorado recently, Xcel Energy had a request for proposals for new generation. And the proposals they got for solar and wind with storage, the offers that they were getting are now cheaper to build those facilities and operate them than it would be to maintain their coal-fired power plants. These are already paid off, fully depreciated, fully rate-based, paid for. And so that was shocking to some people, that we could build new electricity generation and actually have it be cheaper than what we're paying for now. We don't have to wait until it's paid for before it becomes free. It's just cheaper now. And so suddenly there's now kind of a new impetus in front of the Public Service Commission there. People are asking, why are we waiting to retire these coal-fired power plants if we can actually build plants now that would actually provide electricity more cheaply? So I think that people do kind of project onto almost any issue, their political beliefs or preferences. But right now, economics are really pushing the alternatives, and you know, as an economist, I see everything through that kind of lens, the markets. But I think that that we really do have to consider political preferences and consumer preferences. I'll just give one last story. I mean, a Toyota Prius is a common car. Not everybody in Montana drives them, certainly, but we now have hybrid vehicles almost everywhere. When they first came out, auto executives, and I know I have some close friends that were in the top floors at GM, and they would say, why does anybody buy a Prius? Gets the same gas mileage as a regular gas-powered car, and it's 30%, 50% more expensive. And the reason was because some people wanted to make that change because of what it represented and what it did. And that was overlooked by many auto companies because they just looked at it at a dollar and cents kind of thing. Now, of course, with the development of those technologies, they can be built cost effectively. And renewables have kind of been the same way. They were originally expensive, but people were willing to pay more. Deregulation allowed people to express those preferences. And now they've, with the additional development, they're now cheaper. So I guess we do have to think about those things. Other questions?
Thank you for a great presentation. My reading suggests that energy transitions take 50 years or 150 years. It takes a while for these transitions as you're looking in the rearview mirror and you see when they began and when they ended, and they tend to be very disruptive. And if in fact Montana is in the middle of a massive energy transition of some sort and we don't know the outcomes, so this is not a paid political comment. It could be one thing or it could be many things. Is there a benefit to our society here in Montana for that transition to happen and to complete more rapidly, to avoid some of that disruption that we can see in the rearview mirror many times in the past in various parts of the world? And if so, if there is an interest maybe it's more economic to get through these transitions quicker for the communities that are affected. In 2018, are there interventions based on some of the great analysis that you put together? In other words, we think we know what the cultural impacts can and will be. We feel for the communities. Are there interventions that can help shrink transition times? Thank you.
Sure. Well, energy transitions, I would push back a little bit on that in the sense that they don't take very, very long periods of time. 150 years is the entire history, our entire experience with fossil fuels themselves. So unless you're thinking about the transition from what scholars have called an organic to an inorganic economy, right? One reliant on muscle and wind to one reliant on things that we dig out of the ground, be it coal, oil, natural gas. Well, then those are very long time frames. But in terms of a transition between different fossil fuels, those happen pretty quickly, and historically there hasn't been a tremendous amount of disruption with energy transitions within the last 150 years within fossil fuels, because the fossil fuel being transitioned away from is still growing, right? And the new form of energy is simply absorbing more of the energy requirements of an economy and society that's consuming larger and larger amounts of energy, right? Coal has been kind of the exception, right? Like in my presentation, in the early half of the 20th century and today. What can we do for those communities that are negatively impacted by that? I'll leave that to my panelists.
Sociologists.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's tricky in part because we don't necessarily know what the capacity is for change, especially in these really small communities. So, for example, Robert said, well, they could just leave, and that's definitely true, and it's an American tradition. However, we also know that mobility is very class dependent. And so that's a complicated strategy as well. But if that is the strategy, I think direct funds to help people leave is going to be very important, especially for people who are, who've been experiencing poverty for a really, really, really long time, which we know is characteristic of like really resource-dependent places. But if the strategy is to stay, then the focus has to be on economic diversification as well as retraining. And I think, at least in Utah, that's especially important given that there's not union support for that anymore. In Utah, there's no coal unions anymore. And they used to really help people retrain and transition to new industries, and they're not there for that anymore. So direct support for that as well, although I don't have any specifics for you.
One thing I would mention that Robert kind of touched on. So I think your question was, can we use what we've learned from history to adapt to this transition? One of the things that makes this transition much more difficult than the previous ones is exactly what Robert said, which is that demand for energy and economic growth continued anyway. And so while the economy transitioned, you didn't see a major change. It wasn't as dramatic a change as it might have been with respect to, say, the reduction in the use of coal. Now, there was some drop. A really big challenge that we have right now, and this is amazing to people who look at energy, is that electricity demand has completely flattened. It is just separated entirely almost from economic growth. So if you look at last year, for example, electricity demand nationwide fell by over 2%, but the economy grew by almost 3%. And I showed you some of those projections, but on those projections that the Energy Information Agency has looked at, just based on current trends, by 2050, they project that electricity demand in the country will only grow by about 20%, but the economy will almost double in size. So what does that mean? It means in this current environment, when we don't have growing electricity demand but we're transitioning away, it really does mean that there has to be a loser. We don't have a larger pie so that somebody can maintain the size of their slice while the pie gets bigger and others get to enjoy it. And so that's really been the challenge here in terms of energy, is that it really is zero sum. When one area grows, because the pie's gotten no bigger, it's forced another sector to decline. One last question, very short, because we're almost to the end of our panel, so we thank you for that. And there we go.
I am very impressed by your comments that, yes, coal has been around for a long time, and it's probably, the implication is it's going to be around for a long time in the future. However, I also get the impression that it sounds a little bit like we're dancing around the real question. And that is, how do we solve the carbon dioxide problem and the climate change problems so that we can get coal back on track?
Great question. Anybody want to take a swing at that on the panel as our last kind of comment?
Well,
It's like a technology question.
Yeah, it's it can be technology can be part of the solution with carbon. Carbon capture and utilization is the new buzzword. You used to sequester in the ground. Now you use it for other purposes, I guess. And that's got to be. But I think the first thing that you should take away, I think, from what these folks have said is that coal will be with us for a long time, but it's not coming back like that, like what I think you inferred. Even with carbon capture, there are other forces that are working against coal. But carbon capture, and if there's another thing to do with it, like there are 2 now viable carbon capture and utilization plants in North America, right?
I don't know if I would call them viable.
Well, the one in Texas, if you listen to the CEO of NRG, who owns it, they're taking the carbon, right, and using it for enhanced drilling techniques to get out more oil and gas, right? So there's a secondary use for that. They've dollar-abled their carbon. They've monetized it in some ways that have some value. So, and that can be a solution in certain places. The utility down in eastern Wyoming, Mike Douglas, is that? There's a utility in eastern Wyoming that's that's projecting to close within 20 years, and the local mayor there, just outside Gillette, I thought it was, is pushing hard for that technology from the NRG plant down in Texas to come up to the eastern part of Wyoming because there's an opportunity for enhanced drilling there. So you've got to find that right mix. I mean, carbon capture, just let's unleash it on the world, doesn't make economic sense, right? It's expensive, so you've got to be able to recapture some value from it.
If you're asking the question of how to get coal back online, certainly there's a technological component, as James said, but there's so many other components to consider, like the social climate around coal, right? So I think it's a much larger question than just greenhouse gas emissions.
I mean, the larger question is how do you make coal production or coal consumption consistent with, our environmental values, in particular our concern about climate change. And again, I'm not a politician, so I'll tell you not what you want to hear, but what I think is true. And I think the answer is you don't. I don't think it's possible. I mean, I'm that bearish on the future of coal in the sense the federal government has poured billions of dollars. And, Tester came up here this morning, gave a great speech. We got more money for federal research. The federal government has poured billions of dollars into trying to square that, to trying to solve that problem for decades. And hasn't effectively, I mean, there were scrubbers in the 70s, so it's gotten a little bit cleaner, it's gotten a little bit better. There was a big demonstration, carbon sequestration project down in Mississippi that a couple of consortium of utility companies and the federal government were involved in, and the costs on this thing just skyrocketed from something like $2.5 billion over to $7 or $8 billion. I don't think the plant's even going to be completed. And so, I mean, that was going to be the project that proved the economics of carbon sequestration. And it completely fell apart. And I think that's been, certainly within the industry itself, at certain ranks of the industry itself, a source of pessimism.
But just
Go ahead.
the problem is not the technology, the problem is is the economics, right? There's a lot of different carbon sequestration technologies out there, a lot of great and innovative ones. So the problem is economics, which we don't know. I mean, there's got to be entrepreneurs to figure out how to secure a value out of that gas that is captured. And I'm with the panel that the glory days of coal aren't coming back, but I'm less bearish that some economic technological breakthrough is not possible.
All right, I think with that, if you can join me in thanking our panel, thanks again.